Hello, and welcome to Time Jumpers. Can I ask when you are calling from?
1997.
Okay, and you are traveling to when in the future?
2025.
You sure about that?
Yeah, we know.
Okay then. 2 tickets to 2025 will be $20 million.
Can we pay you when we arrive? We just bought shares in Apple.
That's totally fine. Please make your way to Jump Pad 7, and we wish you a pleasant trip.
Technicians of Space Earth, welcome to Hawkbinge, your guide to the latest releases from Hawkwind, which are still coming at a ferocious rate, and long may that continue. And I'm joined as a first-time listener by 2 other first-time listeners, which is Matt, who is still in Berlin. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Andy.
And the one and only Mr. Joe Banks. How are you, Joe?
I'm good, thank you. How are you, Andy?
Glorious, thanks. Other than the fact that it is the crack of dawn on the Saturday, we couldn't quite align our calendars to do Friday, so we're up very early. This album should be retitled There Is No Sleep for Us right now. And I feel relatively bullish about this one. Joe, this is quite an up feeling today.
I think so, yes. I mean, we had a couple of kind of singles beforehand, so to a certain extent knew what we were going to get. But as with all Hawkwind albums, that's not the whole story. But yeah, I think overall, feeling pretty good about this one.
And Matt, you've had a chance to stream it a few times?
A couple of times, yeah. And I think I'm definitely in agreement. I think when I heard the name of the album, I was expecting something much more melancholic, perhaps, a bit more serious. But actually, I largely don't think that's ended up being the issue. I actually feel like the album is much more evocative of the artwork. I feel like we are on some kind of big spacey journey. I think the music definitely matches that vibe a lot for me.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the album title, I thought about it a bit yesterday, and it reminded me of the idea of standing outside the Rolls-Royce dealership, like with your dad, and going, those are beautiful, Dad. And Dad going, they are, son, but they're not for us. You know what I mean? There is no space for us. It was kind of, yep, all this stuff is out there, but it's not for us. And the album kind of bears that out, I think, in the storytelling, which we'll get into. Interesting, Joe, that you mentioned the lead singles. I'm going to just recap very briefly our own journey through our reaction episodes and kind of mention some of those. We did Somnia, which now feels like a completely different age, but we did Somnia. That was our first one. And we were pretty positive on the whole about Somnia. I would say a qualified success for us. It had that long Noi-esque track, Unsomnia, that kicked it off, that Joe, you and I really liked, and Alcyone, another long track on side 1, Matt, that you were into. And side 2 had a lot of shorter songs, a lot of sound design, the entry point, in my opinion, I think, of what we called Talkie Dave. But the lead tracks on it were the kind of straightforward Hawkwind rockers. And they weren't, for us, I think, the best tracks on the album and not massively representative. So that was an interesting one.
I'd like to say quickly just on that, I think Somnia for me is, of all the time jumpy reaction ones, is the one that I feel like repeat listenings will change the most. I remember being a bit unsure about it, but that was also several Hawkbinges ago. And I've listened to the band more, got to know them even more throughout the 90s now. And I do feel like actually Somnia was the most work that I didn't have time to do, where I feel like the other ones were a bit more, easy isn't the right word, but immediate perhaps. Somnia for me is very different to the next 3 that you're about to go through.
And that's interesting because obviously in Hawkbinge terms, we were only up to Quark, Strangeness and Charm when we did Somnia.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's an interesting one. And that would be fun to come back to now. I'm looking forward to 2029 when we reach Somnia. That was followed up by The Future Never Waits. We were all very positive about Future Never Waits, and I still am. There's some great stuff on here, and it's a bit of a classic for me. But again, I think that the lead track from this was Rama the Prophecy, which is a decent track, but it's another kind of Hawkwind space rocker. And actually, the album has so many new things on it that Hawkwind did. This massive 10-minute jazzy, spacey instrumental up front that I remember Matt really liked. And of course, the beginning that we all loved with the incinerators and everything else and the massive synths and the Bonham drums. So that was that one. And it set quite a huge bar. that perhaps unfairly, we didn't really feel that Stories from Time and Space lived up to. We were slightly underwhelmed by Stories of Time and Space. It didn't have quite the same immediacy, I think, but I guess quite tricky releasing the next album after one that's been so well received. And I think, was it the Starship that was released from this, which was very much not a Formula Hawkwind rocker, but a very different vibe, probably more representative. I think, Joe, that you really liked the Starship.
Yeah, I think that actually the only disadvantage of having that as the lead track is that I think, for me anyway, that turned out to be the best track on the album. So
yeah.
The rest of the stuff didn't actually quite come up to that same kind of mark. But there was still kind of interesting stuff on the album, but I felt that after The Future Never Waits, which seemed to be much more of a cohesive album and also kind of sounded great as well, I felt that Stories was a bit of a backward step.
Yep, no, that's very fair. I do remember from this that the track after the Starship, What Are We Going to Do While We're Here, was a track that I really liked and Matt really didn't. So one of those fantastic, completely different points of view. So we come to the new album, There Is No Space for Us, off the back of 3 albums, which we've had completely varied opinions on. One that we were kind of qualified happy with, one that we really loved, one that we were slightly underwhelmed by, and we come to There Is No Space for Us. And I think, as we've already said, we're fairly bullish about this. I actually have 2 extra tracks. I've had a couple of extra days on this on you guys because the vinyl for me arrived on Wednesday night. I only found out this morning when I streamed it that side 4 of the vinyl is not on the streaming. So I have 2 extra tracks than you have. So I'll cover those solo, but they're really interesting ones and worth seeking out. But enough of side 4. We put the vinyl down on side 1, and there is still danger here, Joe.
So it's a great start. It starts with this really fast, dark, deep arpeggiation on the synth. For me, it's a real kind of early 80s Tangerine Dream vibe. For a lot of other people, it might be a bit more kind of 90s trance house vibe. We've heard this kind of sound on Hawkwind records before, but I think Tim Lewis's presence is the big difference here. Like the actual sounds, they're really well integrated. And it's a very exciting start compared to the first track on the last album, Our Lives Can't Last Forever, which is this quite melancholic ballad, which was a very unusual start to a Hawkwind album, whereas this is much more kind of, okay, we're on the launch pad, we're about to go. And so you get the arpeggiation for a couple of minutes, I think it is. And then there's this lift into a classic Hawkwind stun guitar riff. Just before that, Dave has made his entry, and it's a spoken entry as well as the kind of old deep space sage, and talks about our perception of how it all began was flawed. And again, it's difficult at first to kind of understand what he might be talking about, but slightly portentous words. And then, as I say, into the stun guitar riff, classic metronomic sound. And that's very exciting. And then trying to kind of work out what he's talking about is difficult, as I say, but there's this repeated chant towards the end of that section of Humans Came. And it starts to sound a little bit like an alien lament. So it's about humans coming to an alien's planet and they're going, oh my God, it all went wrong because humans came. And of course, this goes back to the actual title of the track, There Is Danger Still. And it's like, okay, where's this danger coming from? There's actually a really nice piece of sound design as well. What sounds like an alien crowd. It's a kind of sound of dismay, which is a lovely piece of sound design. And then about 3:30, it drops down into a mellow section, which was nice. But I have to say, because this has happened quite a bit, I found, particularly on the last album, where you're just getting into a section and then it's like, oh no, we're going to go somewhere else now. And this is a classic example of that. Just as I was thinking, actually, I really could have done with a bit more of that previous section, because it's really exciting, the opening metronomic riff and the chanting. But as it is, it drops down into a perfectly nice kind of mellow section. But that would be the only criticism I have of this track, that I could have done with a bit more of the riff.
Nice. And Matt, your first reaction to the start of this record?
Yeah, it's quite close to Joe, so I'll try not to repeat too much, but I really like how cinematic and wide the sound is. It really feels like they've gone much more epic and layered compared to the last one. It does feel very rich, like the production is much more intricate than we've had before. It doesn't sound like 5 people in a room. It actually sounds like this big sound, and you're almost separating yourself, at least on this track, I feel, from almost the players. It's just sound that you can actually get caught up in quite easily. So I thought that was really nice, again, compared to the last album, which I believe I said that the sound was sometimes a little thin, especially in the drums. And even in this one, even though the drums are still a little bit further back in the mix than I would like, you hear them more. There's more punch, and definitely the cymbals really come through. So I do feel like the percussion is much more in the conversation, which I really like. We build in this really nice wide synth arpeggiations to give us this spacey sci-fi feeling, which is going to become a major theme throughout the whole track. And you do get Dave coming in, reading for me as if he was the Star Wars text crawl, kind of setting up this situation of where we find ourselves. This is going to become a theme all the way through, but I must say I don't massively care for the lyrics really on any of these tracks. It suffers a little bit from that thing which I'm finding Hawkwind are doing more now we've gone through, which is not quite fitting text to the bar. And sometimes the delivery feels not as good as the rest of the instrumentation in places. So that's the one thing I think I need to listen through a little bit more, unfortunately. The fact that we have 4 lines here and 2 rhyme and 2 don't immediately sets me off. So we have past and last, and I'm like, that's kind of a lazy rhyme. Then we have began and flawed, which not even Eminem could rhyme those 2 things together, I think. Yeah, I still need to listen to that a bit more to really kind of get used to it. But after that, we get this big synth riser and what sounds like, as Joe said, this angry ethereal choir that builds us up, and then we get the drums and we're into the full track. So you feel like, cool, now we're going somewhere. I think when it comes to this rather atonal "the humans came" chant, for me it feels a little dirgy, and it actually slows the pace down for me. And I know that they're probably trying to do that to make it sound like, oh God, here come the humans. But even so, it's still a little bit of a dip for me. But when the last quarter of the track goes into this kind of groovy lament with the drums playing this very swing chill beat, and then the guitars come down to meet it, I think it's really nice. It's almost a bit out of place compared to what we've heard, but it's an interesting switch up. And it actually sets up the fact that we are going to be a little bit more Santana-y than I was expecting on this album. In fact, I don't think, not since Astounding Sounds, have I heard Hawkwind explore this sonic space a bit. So it was nice to hear that anyway.
Yeah, I like this as a launching point. Like Joe, I love the arpeggiated intro. It reminded me of the way that The Machine Stops begins. And I remember the excitement that I felt when I first heard that. And Tim is just so good at it. This, for me, feels very much like a Tim album. He's all over this record, and with huge, very positive effect. And I like Dave's storytelling vocal here, because this isn't the talky Dave from Somnia, which was all sitting round the fire talking quite low. This is more Church of Hawkwind, Fall of Earth City, strong sounding Dave. And I like that. And I quite like the story that it sets up. So suddenly there's a lot of confidence as to what we're about to hear through this. So I love that vibe. It was such an interesting and bold choice to start with Our Lives Can't Last Forever on the last one. And I kind of applaud them for making that choice, even though it wasn't actually something that I particularly resonated with, if that makes sense. I quite like the fact that they did something different, even if it wasn't something that massively worked for me. But this is much more of a return to this is how a Hawkwind album begins. So I really like that. There was a point in the track as it's going along, towards the back end of it, there are lots of keyboard sounds going on, lots of brilliant things that you're hearing. And then suddenly there are these keyboard stabs that sound a little bit like horns. And immediately when I first heard it, I kind of recoiled from it, because it reminded me of the kind of horn stabs that Phil Collins used to use in the 90s that I never really gelled with. Weirdly, now I expect them. They fit in the track for me much, much better. So had we done a 10 o'clock on Friday morning, we've only listened to it once, that probably would have annoyed me. But now actually I've heard it 3 or 4 times. It kind of works. But it is interesting that that was my first response. But a strong start. This continues into Space Continues, brackets, Life Forms, a nice instrumental.
Yeah, I like the instant energy of this. The synths sound really good. There's this active sequence that dances around some echoey vocal pads, which add, again, this width and atmosphere. And I think a lot of attention has been paid to the whole sonic range here. There's a nice feeling of space throughout everything. It's a nice use of stereo. This intro really takes its time. It adds this little blippy square wave bass and these resonant pings on top of everything before we suddenly get this very snarey drum pattern. And as you said, these unexpected space horns, which again add to that kind of Santana-y vibe in a way that I was talking about, or almost like a Hawkwind ex Tarantino kind of edit somehow. And I can't tell if the horns are synthetic or not. They sound very real to me, but I know how good synthesis can be. So I'm going to go with they're real until someone tells me otherwise.
I think it is just the keyboard horn sound.
In that case, I'm fairly impressed with how it comes out anyway. I think it's good. And once we've had these horns, Hawkwind continue to go through their synth collection for like another 5 minutes, which I enjoy. I think it might be verging on being called long, but right now I'm not calling it long. It is very active, very thick. There's lots and lots of different sounds that aren't taking up too much time. They're all kind of like blipping around you. So you do feel like it's a big spacey show off. This time we don't end on a riser. We kind of end on the opposite, which I don't know if you call that a lowerer or not. I don't know if there's a technical term for that, but we go into this broody bass pulse that dissipates really nicely. So yeah, for me as an instrumental, it's rich and accomplished. I think it would be really good to see live. And I think actually, I don't think they did these tracks, but I think last time we saw them at the Albert Hall, they had a couple of times when they would just dissolve into this between tracks, and it kind of feels like this is one of those pressed onto records. So I think it's nice to have it on wax and recorded as a thing that they're doing. So yeah, I think it's nice.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's interesting. On the last album, there are a couple of instrumental passages, but already on this album, I kind of feel like the band is quite happy to really lean into these instrumental pieces and draw them out and be patient with them and kind of allow them to evolve. And I really like that. And I think that happened a lot on Future Never Waits. There are huge long instrumentals on that, but less so, I think, on Stories from Time and Space. I'm very happy to have those back. There's a quote from Tim that it's one of my favorite quotes ever. At Hawkfest, the one that I went to in Maidenhead, in the Q&A, somebody said, "What have you learned from being in Hawkwind?" And it got round to Tim, and he thought for a minute and he went, "I've learned to shut up and make space noises," which I thought was excellent, basically, and gave you an insight into maybe what the studio chat can be sometimes. And he makes space noises, and he makes them really, really well. So yeah, I like this a lot, and I'm very happy to lean into it. And I'm digging these Hawkwind instrumentals. What do you reckon, Joe?
Yeah, that's funny, actually, Tim's quote about make space noises, because, of course, that was something that Del Detmar said as well, but he said that more negatively, that was all he was ever allowed to do. He wanted to do more than just make space noises. So we've got this arpeggiation going on again. This is like a feature of the entire album. It's almost like whenever there's a drop, there's this variation on the arpeggiation. It's almost like it's a sound environment that the album is kind of sitting within. And I really like it because, as I said, we've heard these kind of sounds on Hawkwind albums before, but sometimes it does sound a bit like, okay, I press this button, this sequence came out, sounds great, let's go with it. Whereas, as Matt said, this is a lot more nuanced than that. It's been properly worked out. The sounds are so nice as well. I did do my notes to this quite late last night after I'd had a limoncello or two. And I've got written down here that it's like the sound of amino acids combining to create life. I guess the subtitle, Life Form, which is interesting because obviously that's also the title of a little short instrumental on PXR5. So
yes, of course, yeah.
If we're meant to kind of take anything from that. And I love those trumpets. I think you're right. I think they are synthetic, but they're very, very good. And used in a really nice, tasteful way, not in a kind of horrible Phil Collins way, that's for sure. It harks a lot more, in fact, Back to the Future Never Waits. And Tim has really, in a way that Simon House, when he came on board with Hawkwind, really changed their sound. Tim has done the same. And something I talk about in my piece for Prog Magazine, if anybody hasn't read that yet, about Warrior on the Edge of Time. Quick advert there. But Tim has done a very similar function. And it may even be just as simple as the kind of keyboards that he's brought with him. But he's obviously got such a good ear for sound. And that's really, I think, reflected in these tracks. And I've just got here, there's a real complexity an instrumental breadth to what he does. And I really like this track, really, really like it. Also, just wanted to mention there's some really nice rhythmic work from Richard Chadwick in here. Often easy to kind of overlook his work, but I think he does really well here. So this is one of my favorite tracks on the album.
Yeah, all good points indeed. And it's interesting comparing Tim in terms of what he's done for Hawkwind to Simon House, because another Hawkwind keyboard player that I reference a little bit later, he really is a standout on the record. And I love that bed that he creates for Hawkwind to play on top of. All of this leads us to what was the lead-off single for this album, which is Co-Pilot. And for me, this being the fourth one that we've done reactions to, Co-Pilot for me is the strongest lead-off single that they've had. I know, Joe, that you really liked the Starship last time round. Again, it doesn't necessarily represent the breadth of the album, but it's got so much going on that it made me quite excited for the release of the album, which is what a good lead-off single should do. It starts off quite chill. It's got something, I don't really know if it is bossa nova, but it's kind of got that vibe to it. And it was really interesting. I wasn't expecting that, but I sank into it quite nicely. Had some nice guitar lines, and the song has room to breathe, and it's got some positive vibes. Hawkwind have done quite a lot of it over the past two records. Dave singing about love and being with someone, which isn't, I don't think, traditional Hawkwind territory. But actually, it's that allows me to really buy into the authenticity of it, because it's not a staple of Hawkwind. There are some lines in here that are used in several songs on the album, and that also appear a fair bit, I think, on Stories from Time and Space. There's a fair bit of looking into your eyes and being a traveler of time and space. There's a notion, I think, that a lot of this was recorded at much the same time as Stories in Time and Space. And I think the inference when I heard that, at least in my head, was that these were the things that didn't make Stories in Time and Space. But actually, to me, it's more like they've saved the strongest material for this. Yeah, I really like this. It piqued my interest for the album. I like the fact that it has room to breathe. I like the lyrics and Dave's voice in it. And for me, it works, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. Hearing this as a lead-off single got me excited for the album. That riff at the start is absolutely lovely, and the way that you've got I think it's congas, somebody's just playing hand drums with it, some really lovely vibes, nice bit of guitar comes over the top of it, and it's such a lovely piece of arrangement. Got down here, it sounds credible, which is always sounds like, not the greatest way of describing something, but there's no sense at any point of this being kind of phoned in. It's like, we jammed it out and that'll do. It's very, very well arranged, some really lovely layers to lose yourself into. It also feels so fresh and clean. It's not muggy and dense like the traditional Hawkwind sound was. Sometimes you get the sense that the sound has ended up being muggy and dense just because it hasn't been recorded very well, it hasn't been mixed very well, whereas this is the complete opposite of that. Really sounds lovely and fresh. Yeah, wistful, heartfelt vocal section. Dave's voice, even, I think he's 83 now, is it? And unmistakable that it's Dave Brott, which is one of the things that obviously makes it a Hawkwind record. I like the cooing backing vocals that we get. Again, I think there was some debate online as to whether this is actually an actual female backup singer or whether it's some kind of pad or sample or something that they used. But they've used this quite a bit now, and it's very effective. And yeah, and the whole, the song is, Dave, I think himself has said that it's a song to Chris, his wife. So that's nice. But I also like the idea of, throughout science fiction, as the idea of the mothership, the female heart of the spaceship. So that's kind of an interesting inference as well. But yeah, overall, I really like this track. Really good.
Excellent. And Matt, obviously, we are co-pilots of Hawkbinge. Your take on this? I believe you were pretty positive on this.
Yeah, I think as soon as you hear that guitar, you realize this is different. So if they were recorded at the same time, it is an immediate departure. And if you're going to be intelligent with your single choices, I think this makes a lot of sense to make it clear that this is not like the album you just heard, which, again, for us, considering we were a little lukewarm on it, was very exciting. Again, this has that kind of Santana-y vibes that I talked about from Astounding Sounds, that kind of Steppenwolfiness, but brought way up to date. It's got these kind of like loose grooves and samba guitar and keys all the way through it. And exactly like Joe said, it's played with aplomb. It doesn't sound like they're messing around with something that they haven't spent time really getting into. It feels legit. And again, it's an intro which is happy to take its time. It slowly, almost imperceptibly slides from the initial groove into something more more quote unquote straightforward. And the drums turn from these gentle rim shots to metallic thunks and clangs, and the soft synthy beds swirl in to fill the space between everything. So you do feel like this track actually sneaks up on you. It starts very groovy and quite sparse, but then you blink, you're 3 minutes in, and suddenly you're in this big, rich, soupy, layered track. I'm not still loving the lyrics, but the singing through the distorted microphone is cool. It adds an extra texture and kind of whimsy to it, which does make it feel like it's got a bit more earnestness to it. It's got more emotion in its delivery. The fact that the lyrics are also pulled back in the mix, I quite like, because then it feels like parts of it rather than like being over the top of everything else, which isn't what I'm enjoying about this album. But the track is definitely involved in everything that's going on, and there is a lot going on, you know, with the vocals, lead key changes, backing ooze, big drums. It's really fighting hard to keep your attention, and it certainly does. Compared to the last couple of tracks, this arrangement almost feels like it could be part of a musical or a TV soundtrack or something. You know, there's so many layers to it. It doesn't feel quite the same as a song. It feels like it could be an atmosphere. You know, I could see the Gravity style film where someone's running from an exploding ship in slow motion in space, and this track's playing, and it's more of a feeling than something you hear in a way. You know, it's very different in that respect. The outro, as well as in No Rush to Leave, turning Dave's last vocal into this drawn out gasped pad, which I think is really cool. And again, whether or not the band have got hold of like a granulator or something which can sample and mess with it, I think that's quite new, at least from where we are up to 97. So I do like this stretchy sidechained organ and everything that they're playing with. So even though this is a synth heavy album, you're always hearing new things in each track, which is cool. The only thing that really perplexes me is that there's a lady doing a countdown and she doesn't count down properly. I don't know if you hear this, but as a build, she goes 6, 5, 7, 9, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm like, why are you counting wrong? I don't know why it's doing that. I don't know if it's part of the story and it's like a co-pilot computer that's going wrong or something, but every time it does that, I get completely thrown out because I'm thinking about that for a minute. But anyway, I'm allowed to get drawn back in, but a perplexing choice. I think it's nice. I think it starts great, ends great. It is almost a single in terms of it exists in its own space, but it also exists within the album, I would say. I think it's placed nicely. It's a key highlight after the instrumental. I've definitely given Hawkwind crap for not ending tracks well before, but so far, no complaints so far.
Good. So for those of us with the vinyl, that ends side one, and a pretty strong side one. We flip the record over, and we get a big track here with an epic title, Joe. Changes, brackets, Burning Suns and Frozen Waste.
Yeah, that's quite a title. I think this might be my favourite track on the album. As I say, I only heard it a couple of times. But yeah, this, as I was saying, this is another track which kind of starts with those chirruping synths in the background, that sound environment I talked about. It's almost like the background radiation of space, if you like. And then we get this really nice riff from Dave, quite understated. It really reminds me of the riff that you hear at the start of Down Through the Night on Space Ritual. And then the track builds. Then we get into a really nice chunky bit of propulsion, as I've written down here. So, yeah, the track really picks up. And we're getting some really nice, almost Hugh Lloyd Langdon-esque guitar. And I'm kind of unsure. I mean, sometimes kind of you hear the solo guitar on this album, you think that's definitely Dave. Other times, I don't know whether it's Magnus or whether it's Magnus and Dave together. It sounds like there's a twin guitar thing going on here. But anyway, as I said, it does remind me a bit of Hugh's kind of supercharged tone he used to have, kind of lots of sustain and reverb. Good, strong vocal. And it's also features one of the lines from Lord of Light, Beyond the Realms of Ancient Light. Also talking about love will flourish. So again, as you said, Andy, there's much more of a hopeful, almost utopian tone to the vocals here and kind of what the song seems to be about. Much more hopeful spin on space exploration, certainly compared to the Black Corridor or whatever. It's the idea that somehow we can find a better life and a better world for ourselves, having left the Earth. So it's a good, strong, sturdy song, very cohesive. And I think that's the only other thing I've got down here that I like about it is that I think the song is, I haven't got the timings in front of me, but I think it's about 9 minutes long, that it pretty much keeps with that same riff the whole way through and it develops it and it lots of layers over the top. but it's not a long song because they've chucked in this section and then they've changed to this. And that's always was, a core Hawkwind strength, the ability just to have the central riff and work around that. And I think this is a really good modern example of that. And I'm really pleased that a lot of the songs on the album are like this, that they're actually sticking to a core groove or a core riff, and they're kind of working around it. So, as I said, I think this is possibly my favourite track on the album.
Excellent. So it's Burning Suns for Joe. Matt, is it Burning Suns for you or Frozen Waste?
Well, given the fact it's called Changes, Burning Suns and Frozen Waste, I was hoping the next track would be called Thawed Waste, because I feel like that would be the result of bringing Frozen Waste close to a burning sun. A theme is emerging here with the intros, for sure. Glitzy synths over pads, which then build into something. And we have this again, but this time it's very short as an intro. And we kick everything up a notch with some big drums very quickly and a more howling guitar that sounds more like the kind of stuff we got in the 90s. So I think I'm very much with Joe in that respect. Then it turns out we've been building this big sonic bed for Dave. And at the risk of repeating myself, the lyrics are not doing a lot for me. The delivery's fine, but it's not as interesting as Copilot that we've just had, which I actually vibed a lot with. This is a bit more standard, and the standard stuff isn't quite gelling with me yet. I know that Hawkwind have been touring with Arthur Brown for quite a while recently, and I wonder if some of this is rubbing off on Dave, because I feel like some of these tracks, I do find him a little bit more waily and performative than he's been before. The delivery is not as bad as something like Sadness Runs Deep for me, but there are some parts that reminded me of it. The odd line that isn't quite fitting, the rhymes, which I feel like you could have spent a little bit longer finding something a bit cleverer, last and past and all this kind of stuff. It always just feels a little first thought, which is a shame given how good Hawkwind can be with lyric writing. And again, even as far as the last couple of albums with Beginnings, I don't think it's something that they've fallen off from recently. I think it's something that they still can really obviously do. But the instrumentals after the blocks of vocals are very cool. Big animated drums and a great interplay between the bass and the guitar. So I'm with Joe that this is actually, Joe, the longest track on the album, but it doesn't feel like the longest track on the album, if you get me. So definitely the length to experience is a net positive. There's something that holds my interest enough to listen past the vocals and enjoy everything else around them. So while I don't think this is my favorite track, it's certainly actually up there, and I do find a lot to enjoy, even if there's some stuff that I still need to process going forward.
It's up there for me as one of my favorite tracks on the album. I know what you mean about the lyrics and the delivery. There's a point on the album, I can't exactly remember where it is now, but where you get travelers of time and space rather than just travelers of time and space. It doesn't grate with me as much as it grates with you, probably because I'm so used to it now that I barely hear it. But this one for me is really strong. And I got vibes of two things from this. I got some shades of Spirit of the Age early on in this track. And then as it develops, it actually ends up with quite a strong Levitation vibe for me. And part of that is that Tim Lewis, I think, just reminds me of Tim Blake in some of the things and the way some of the freakouts work. And I love that. So, yeah, this one was developing nicely. And then we get that big kind of heavy rock bass line. And I think that's the heaviest bass line I've heard Hawkwind do for quite a while. That is Doug McKinnon properly kicking in. It's not a complex bass line. It doesn't need to be. That's not what Hawkwind do. But it really drives the track. It's very exciting. And they let it breathe and they let it go. And it's got this early 80s sound for me, but not in a bad way. Usually when I talk about an 80s sound, I'm not being complimentary. But in this case, I think it really works. And I love this track. It's definitely up there as one of my favorites on their album. Another one for me, which has become a favorite of mine, is the title track, There Is No Space for Us. Hawkwind in the Old West. I'm here for it, Matt. Are you?
Yeah, a title track that's not the first track and the shortest track on the album. So there's the surprise. Yeah, for me, it's nice to hear the acoustic guitars coming out on this album. It feels very lo-fi in that way. Like we've removed all the spaciness for a second. We're having a bit of a break. And I like the fact that we have this little shaker that accompanies the guitar to give that lo-fi vibe to the percussion as well. But again, it sounds really nice, but it sounds very people in a room, which is, again, a different feeling that you've got from this album so far. This reminds me of the Firefly title song.
I've got that written down myself. Exactly that.
Yeah. It gives me that space cowboy vibe that I mentioned before that I think is cool. So despite the track being under 4 minutes, it feels like the first 2 minutes are almost full intro again before we break out to the full drum kit and song. So I wonder if there is an extended version of this somewhere that they decided to cut down. I'm not sure. But after 2 minutes of a 4-minute song, you think, oh, this is what it's going to be. But actually, no, it switches up in the latter 2 minutes. And when we get to the lyrics, there's this kind of like spitting vitriolic attack on the future of mankind and the heralding of a great do-over of the earth. We have this line, no life in the sea, starvation for you and me. So checkmate, pescatarians. And the rain will wash away the human stain on this earth, which is probably the best delivered vocals on the album at the current time of speaking. I'm just not a big fan of the subject matter. There's that truth that horror films sell better when the economy is good, because I think people enjoy the idea of horrors and stuff when actually there's not one going on. And I feel just right now with the way that the year is currently starting and like all the news and hearing what's going on with, certain world orders and that kind of thing, I don't want to hear about humans being a stain right now. I would rather us work to make sure that's not true before we can start to go back to complaining about it again. Again, for me, maybe in time I'll enjoy it a little bit better. But as a whole, sonically, the track's really nice. At the end of the track, we also transition into the next one, which is something that I've always said would be good if Hawkwind continued to do, and they are. So well played on that. Yeah, I think it's overall it's a good track. I just think right now it's just maybe like cutting a little close than I want to think about when I'm listening. But yeah, on the whole, considering sometimes the title tracks I don't always get on with, I think this is definitely one which deserves its title and its place on the album.
I agree. This is the other track for me, which is my favorite on the album, which means that side 2 is really strong for me. I love that Firefly feel, that space cowboy thing. It feels very Hawkwind, although I've never heard Hawkwind do it before. Somebody may throw a reference at me, but I don't remember it. And at first I was like, what? Basically, and it develops. It's like, this is amazing, and I love that. And I actually really am here for the subject matter. This is angry Hawkwind, and I think when something bad happens, different people have very different reactions to it in what they would choose to listen to. So I can imagine some people want to listen to something happy to make them feel better. Some people want to listen to something kind of morose and downbeat because it allows them to get those feelings out. And some people might want to throw on, I don't know, the Sex Pistols and get kind of adrenaline and get angry. So I guess where this one sits for you will depend on what you need right now. I was kind of here for the stain of humankind. It felt quite resonant. And of course, when they recorded this, I guess that wasn't happening to quite the same degree that it currently is. So it's timely. And I like this story of a kind of post-human rebirth, that actually everything's beautiful once we've been and gone. Vibes with me quite a lot. And I like the way that space cowboy bleeds into quite nicely. It's not a jarring change or one of these where you're enjoying the moment and then suddenly it shifts. It kind of morphs a little bit more. Some nice loops and arpeggiation again. As you say, Joe, it's the sonic environment that the album is recorded in. And yeah, a big favorite for me. And particularly coming off the back of the previous big favorite, I feel like we're on a bit of a roll. How about you, Joe?
I thought it was possibly more of a folk rock riff, the start, rather than the cowboy vibe. But now that you've said that, I totally hear that. I was hearing it a little bit more upbeat, Bertie Yanch kind of thing. But yeah, but really nice. Again, a slight deviation from what you'd expect from Hawkwind, but works perfectly well. It's like Hawkwind have, throughout their history, have been brilliant at assimilating other types of music and turning it into Hawkwind music. And this is a great example of that again. I think everything has been said already about the lyrics, but it actually, as you were talking about it, it just occurred to me that the title, There Is No Space for Us, is actually about there's no space for man on Earth. Compared to everything else that's on Earth, there's no space for us, and actually it's time for us to head off into space. And of course, this fits with the idea of being file transferred to the stars by our AI overlords once they've got rid of us, so that a new creation will arise, as the lyrics say. I think that there's a real strain of what I would call extreme environmentalism has been running through Dave's kind of lyrics and thinking for a long time. The fact that the problem on Earth is man. I mean, this is the whole thing about global warming or climate crisis, is that people talk about, oh no, it's the end of the world. And it's like, it's not the end of the world. This is about the end of man. The planet will become unlivable for man, but it will be probably fine for a lot of other species. And to a certain extent, I guess that's what this is about. As I said, it's a nice deviation from the norm for Hawkwind, but enjoyable track.
Yeah, you're right. It has been the theme for such a long time. We took the wrong step years ago and all that. So it's a beautiful continuation of that. I can imagine it must be very frustrating for Dave to have sung about this in 1970 and still be singing about it now. But we go somewhere very different with the next track. As Matt said, we segue very easily into the outer regions of the universe, which is quite a good place to be. And I haven't got too many notes on this other than the fact that for me, it's a really nice, moody breakdown, a kind of good, chill, spacey vibe. There's a bit of Whispering Dave. There's a bit of Dave doing Bob Harris here, which I quite like. And just as a piece, it really works well for me. And as a end to side two, after those two big tracks, it's actually a beautiful outro to that side of the vinyl. Matt, you were here for this.
Yeah, after the animated apocalypse prediction, that was the last track. This track is happy to lounge about in a sea of reverb, creating these kind of muted washes that these kind of salacious strums fall into again and again to create this evolving pad. And I think the last few albums have had a Hawkwind atmosphere on it, but this one has a more growth and animation compared to the other ones, I think. And like you said, we get Whispery Dave over the top muttering about destruction, which hashes my mellow maybe a little bit, but it's not around for so long, so I can push past it. It's okay. And then it breaks into a kind of 90s proto drum and bass vibe with this deep, subby but warm bass and little plinky, short, sharp drums, snaps and clacks. For me, it could almost be an early Everything But the Girl or Easy Rollers kind of demo. So I think it sounds very good. I think it's very nicely mixed and produced again. It's doing something electronic that Hawkwind never did in the 90s that we've been listening to, but they're kind of finally doing it now. And I think it's quite accomplished in that way. So I think for me, this currently is my favorite track on the album. Maybe again, because it calls to my electronic sensibilities a bit more, but it's not just another atmosphere. The fact it breaks down into this quite low, subby, groovy number. Again, a bit like the stuff we had on the co-pilot, it sounds accomplished. It doesn't sound like they're just playing with something they don't understand. So it's nice to hear them break into this for the album. So yeah, as you said, I am here for this one.
Nice. And more Tim Lewis love on Hawkbinge. We go to side 3 of the vinyl.
You don't want my opinion.
Oh, sorry. Good Lord. No.
You know what? It would have been absolutely fine to get past me there, because I literally don't have anything else to add to what you guys said, other than just to kind of say I also do enjoy this track a lot. At first, I was thinking, okay, so when it starts off, is this going to be the intro to something else? But it's not. It's actually just kind of extends, very effective chill out track. And as Matt says, we then get into this nice groovy section. And I was wondering whether it was a synth bass or a real bass that was playing that kind of circular line. Again, it sounds like it's damning it with faint praise, but it's really not. It's actually a very accomplished track for what it is. And really, the only thing I wanted to note was, as you say, Whispery Dave saying, "Time waits for no man," is, of course, the first line, again, of Our Lives Can't Last Forever.
Ah, of course.
Yeah, so call back to that as well. But yeah, a good track. Yeah, enjoyed this one.
Nice. Well, apologies, Joe. To make up for it, I'll come to you first and ignore Matt this time for Neutron Stars, brackets, Pulsating Light.
So this one turned out to be, I think, the one track on the album which is a bit of a throwback to Somnia, actually, I thought. So it starts off again with the synthy stuff, but it's a bit chillier than we've had up until this point. As you often get with Hawkwind tracks, you're thinking, is this going to go somewhere? And it absolutely does. About 1 minute in, this very fierce, Larry riff kicks in. Definitely the most aggressive thing on this album, and one of the most aggressive things we've probably heard from Hawkwind in a while. And for some bizarre reason, it reminded me of The Fall. I've got Rockabilly Space Rock written down here. It's got that angry man in a pub vibe. And it's good. It's the one track on the album that really flirts with chaos and is a bit of a glorious mess. It's great. I liked it. As I said, though, it does kind of hark back a little bit to that Somnia sound, where the kind of rocky tracks where they sounded like they were almost a little out of control, which is, not a bad thing in itself. But compared to everything else that we have here, this feels less nuanced than some of the other songs. I was having trouble picking out the lyrics, but there's the thing about "we command and you'll be slaves." So again, it may be evil man leaving Earth to then go and enslave another planet. Who knows? But yeah, so it's quite a cool track. As Matt would say, it does kind of slightly harsh the mellow of the rest of the album.
Yeah, true. Matt, maybe Angry Man in a Pub is the album Hawkwind are born to make.
It's very raw. It's the rawest thing we get. And I think we get that even from the beginning because the opening is pure soundscape. It's isolating and it's atonal, definitely more atonal than we've had before from the album, I think. Maybe I thought it's what you encountered when you go beyond the outer region of the universe. We're out into some uncharted, dangerous territory on a little ship. And then out of the soundscape comes the most quote unquote normal rock track we've had so far on the album. And I wonder, I think they've probably been more wild. And I think in the 90s with Ron Tree that we've been listening to, they've certainly been wilder, but maybe compared to everything on this album, it certainly sounds a bit more out of control. And I actually wrote that down myself as well, that it feels like it's going a little bit off the rails, but kind of in a fun way. I think as we get to the end of the album, we've had a lot of spaciness, a lot of floatiness. It's kind of nice to have one of these, again, just to fill the oeuvre on the album. This is another Dave vocal platform, which, as I said before, it's okay, not quite my favorite yet. But what I found funny is that the vocals are delivered in the same way as Curtis Blow's That's the Breaks. So every time Dave says a line, I find myself going, that's the breaks in between. But that's just me being an idiot. The sonics all around the lyrics are chaotic and messy and heavy and interesting for me. You know, there's a lot of texture there to get into it. There's a lot to keep your ears happy. And clearly Hawkwind still know how to let loose and freak out on their instruments, which is good to hear, like I said, on a relatively calm album. And at the end, the rhythm almost goes into a psychotic space waltz, which, like the first track, is kind of cool, but also maybe a little misplaced for the track. But maybe they're just trying to calm it down, and that's the way they do it, by switching up the tempo and the vibe at the very end. So not quite sure about that ending, but on the whole, I do enjoy this track on the album just to flesh out kind of all corners of what Hawkwind are playing with right now.
Yeah, some interesting references we've heard so far for this one. Interesting callback that you made, Joe, to Somnia. I hadn't thought of that, but I totally do now. This perhaps is one where listening on the vinyl makes quite a big difference because each side of the vinyl feels like it's of a piece. And therefore, this is the beginning of a new thing for me rather than a continuation from outer region of the universe. So the fact that it is kind of at odds vibe wise doesn't impact me quite as much as perhaps it does if I was to listen to it on Spotify. And I love that initial bit. It doesn't last very long, but that kind of screamy bit in the sound design, I really like it. And then it kind of becomes old school Hawkwind. It's a very different track to something like Born to Go, but Born to Go was what came into my head when that ramps up. And I really liked it. I like the fact that they still do that. That rockabilly beat is something that I always have to get used to, the kind of straight aheadness of it. But once I do, I sink into it. It's got really, really good energy. There's so much great energy coming through this record that I think felt to me was lacking on the last one. Just that energy and excitement is in this track. So yeah, it's a nice one. And I quite like the voicing and the guitars when they come in, and it works for me. Dave just sounds stronger on this record as well. I mean, again, don't know whether the vocals were recorded at the same time as the previous album, but Dave sounds more dynamic and vibrant on this record than he did on the last one. So yeah, the man's getting younger. What can you say? Now, for you guys, this is the final track on the record. It isn't for me, so we'll go into that in a little bit. But we end on something of a more wistful note, Joe. We are a long, long way from home.
So, yeah, it's a tasteful canter into the sunset.
Well put.
Until Dave comes in and just sings the title at the end, it's essentially an instrumental. There's some nice kind of slow soloing from Dave. The cooing backing vocals are back again. Probably the most interesting bit about this track is the piano. There's some really nice piano vamping in it, which is a nice touch. Again, not the kind of instrument you normally associate with Hawkwind, but works really well here. And it's the sound of a band at ease of itself is, I think, my conclusion. I mean, some might argue that's not always a good thing, but I think it's real indicative of the fact that this is the third album with the same lineup. And as a lot of people have said, this already feels like the third part of a trilogy, though obviously we don't know what they're going to do next. It might be then the third part of a quartet, who knows? But it's actually quite unusual for Hawkwind to have had the same lineup for over that length of time. And that seems to just really be reflected in this song, in the way that they're all playing together. It's not forced at all. Again, it's a very nicely arranged song, and it's a very kind of mellow way to end the album. And I liked it. It's good.
Matt, does this bring it home for you?
Kinda. It's definitely a light, slightly wistful ending. I would completely agree. It's not cowboy acoustic lo-fi this time, but it still feels very pared down. Again, after the freak out we've just had, the difference between the two is very big. The guitars here sound clean and unprocessed. The drums are simple and soft. The tempo is relaxed. For me, it has almost campfire stargazing vibes, almost like a Lemon Jelly track in its steady repetition, but with noodling over the top. So it's very easy to settle into. And I also made a note about the piano. Anytime you add a good piano, you add instant whist, and definitely I find myself settling into this track more as it flows along, and it's got a nice emotion to it. And the fact that they can bring that kind of emotion again after the last track that was more atonal and weird, again, it speaks to their range right now as a band and what they can produce. Yeah, I really like this until the last few seconds, and isn't that annoying? For two reasons, I think. One, that I feel like Dave can't leave well enough alone and just has to say something at the end, which I feel is completely unnecessary. It also, I think, is the worst delivery of a line on the album. It feels slightly out of key or slightly trepidatious. So for that to be the last thing you hear, it's kind of an annoyance. And then the track just fades afterwards. So we were doing so well, but I feel like we trip and fall at the last moment to end the track. And then also the album for me as a streamer. So I do feel like we end on a slightly disappointing final note, even if the track itself is largely very nice to listen to.
It's really interesting because I remember a very long instrumental on The Future Never Waits called They Are So Easily Distracted.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of that track, the voice comes in, and it's the last 30 seconds of like a 10-minute track. And that grated on you, not hugely because you like the track, but you didn't see the need for it. Joe and I thought that was very effective, and we quite liked it. So it's interesting here because actually I quite like Dave's little outro at the end. It feels like it bookends things nicely. For me, obviously, this is the end of a side, not the end of the whole album. So it's a very different thing. But yeah, I like this. This was probably the thing for me that was the most similar in tone to Stories from Time and Space, in that wistful, more melancholic maybe kind of feel to it, which is what I've taken to be the vibe of the previous record. But given that what it's sitting in musically is something that I connect with so much more, what I bring to this makes this work for me much better than I think it would have done on the previous record. I like the guitar playing. It is that kind of laid back thing. I try and imagine it now as the end of the album, and I maybe feel myself needing something of a coda, but it's quite difficult. So I played this morning, just as I was walking around the flat on the iPad on Spotify, just to give myself the vibes. And then this ended, and then it stopped. And I was waiting for the next track, and I didn't get it. And I remarked to Matt off air that to me it was like someone taking your last piece of chocolate. I didn't have closure because of the way this ended. The next thing didn't begin. It's definitely a drifting off rather than an explosive end. And so much of the rest of the album has a lot of energy to it. It's an interesting contrast. But yeah, I do enjoy it. And I do like Dave's little bit at the end. And they do this a bit. They did this on the beginning, the huge track from The Future Never Waits, didn't they? Where there's that little bit of Dave at the end. And it works nicely for me. I quite like Dave's voice on those. So that, for you guys, ends There Is No Space for Us. For me, there is a side 4. And side 4 has 2 tracks on it, which are both pretty long. Thinking about the fact that they're not on the stream, I can kind of get why they're effectively bonus tracks on the vinyl. Practical Ability begins with what I'm pretty sure is the bass line from The Future Never Waits, the title track, the opening track, which is quite a nice, simple, groovy bass line. If it's not exactly the same, it's very, very close. And Dave effectively talks, but not like a whisper kind of a vocal, not the chatty kind of Dave. It's more pronouncing Dave. Tells a story of a book called Practical Ability. He might even be improvising it. It's quite hard to know. These aren't things that rhyme. There's just the track going on underneath and Dave telling this story over the top of it. Grimace is back, and this time it doesn't even have to rhyme with anything. It just happens, and it actually made me smile because when it happened on Somnia, we talked about it quite a lot because it was quite egregious the way it rhymed with face. Here it just happens, and now I kind of feel it's a Dave trademark, basically, and I'm here for it.
I was about to say, like, once is a mistake, twice is jazz, right?
Exactly.
So if you just keep saying it enough, that's just how it's said. So
Exactly. I heard it from Eric Clapton. I don't know if it's originally his. He said, if you play a wrong note, keep playing it. People think you're a genius.
yep.
So, yeah, I like that. There's a transformation again once the talking is done. We get some powerful drumming. Tim comes in with a bit of a Blake special freak out, which I really love. Tim does it so well, and I just enjoy listening to it. And that's practical ability. And then Second Chance, which rounds out the album for me, is basically just a good old Hawkwind space rock workout. It's an instrumental. It's got a lot of energy, nice bouncy track, lots of good synths, big bass, but it sounded really nice. You know, it's nice to hear Hawkwind again with that kind of energy and bounce to it. So, yeah, for those of you who have the streams, I'm sure at some point these two tracks will become available or surface digitally somewhere. And I would seek them out. Yeah, I like them. And they are, for me, a completely different energy in ending the album. It's not the wistful drift off ending that you get from the stream. It's much more energetic, almost like an encore, actually, which I guess fits with these things as vinyl bonuses. So, yeah, very different for me than for you guys. And that is the album. That's the music. And on the whole, I don't think there was anything in there that really grated on us or that we really were too negative about. That felt pretty positive all the way through, Joe.
Yeah, I think, as I said at the start, even though there obviously is differentiation of tone throughout the album and there's different kind of styles, it just feels like a much more cohesive album than certainly Stories was. And I think that's partly actually looking back on Stories is because there were quite a lot of short tracks on that, which sometimes just didn't feel like they were going anywhere. But all of the tracks here actually are given room to develop properly. But as I said, I think the defining thing for me is the way that the longer tracks evolve naturally. They often kind of are cleaving just to kind of one or two themes. And that for me is a real classic Hawkwind thing that they do. And I really like hearing that again. I think the album's maybe a little bit front loaded again, like the tracks I really like near the start. But as you said, there's nothing on this that makes me think, oh no, not that one again. I'm happy to listen to this the whole way through. And I do have some sympathy with Matt's issues with Dave's lyrics and the way he words things. But I just think that, Dave is the heart of Hawkwind and he gets to do his thing. And it's incredible that he's still doing it. But yeah, so I think overall, if we talk about the three albums that have had this lineup, it's not as strong as The Future Never Waits, but I think it's definitely better for me than Stories.
Yeah, agree. Matt, there's no sign of any let up. It's a strong one.
No, we're going to be reviewing these forever.
I think so.
This album's been much easier and more fun to get into than the last one. To use a technical term, the listen to ability has increased a lot for me. And again, at 8 tracks that hit the 50-minute mark or something, this feels much more like a nice album listening experience rather than some of the stuff we've been hearing in the 90s, or even the last album was well over an hour, wasn't it? So it does feel like it's a lot. This feels a nice amount. So I'm definitely down for that. In a way, where we've got to with our current reviews, like Distant Horizons, I like the fact that this feels less of a grab bag than maybe some of the other stuff has felt like. Again, this feels like the band coming together over a more cohesive idea of what they want to produce. And again, maybe because the last album was a bit more, they were trying everything and they cut this out and went, actually, this is a nice 50 minutes. And the rest of the stuff is the stuff. And they're just going to be stories. Again, stories, plural. Doesn't sound like story one, which you're going to listen to. It sounds more like something that you pick through, and it is maybe a succession of tracks where this, I feel like you can listen from beginning to end and it feel like an album. Even the fact that some of the tracks flow into each other and that kind of thing, there's a lot of good consideration here, so I do feel like this is the band feeling cohesive and producing complex and intricate work, and it's the kind of sound you can only get when everyone agrees in the direction that you're going. Otherwise you just get a huge mess, and we certainly don't have that here. I hope when we get to this album properly, I'll be more at peace with Dave's voice. It's possible that jumping from 97 to 25 isn't helping. But yeah, I think definitely when we heard the Co-Pilot single, I was intrigued to hear what the rest of the album was going to be. And even though I haven't spent more than 24 hours with it, it's been a very enjoyable 24 hours and I've enjoyed talking about it already. So yeah, stay tuned in however long in the future when we get to do it again.
Exactly. it feels kind of unprecedented, this last 10-year run of putting out, maybe longer than 10 years, like an album a year. So many bands who come from that part of history, if they do still record albums, it's like once a decade and nobody really cares much for them. And they play hardly any of it live. And it's all quite wistful. Weren't things good back in the old days? And Hawkwind just keep going as if they are a new band. It sounds fresh to me. This could easily be their 5th album rather than their 36th or 37th or whatever it is. And that does feel unique. I feel quite lucky that the band that we do our podcast about and the band that I've seen for so many years keeps doing that. That's quite amazing to me. And Dave does sound just fresher, I think, on this. And I really like the energy. They're not running out of energy. They seem to be able to find new wells of it. It's interesting to me that Stories from Time and Space was kind of in the shadow of The Future Never Waits, but that means that it doesn't cast a shadow over the next one, and this one emerges very much as its own thing in that respect. And yeah, looking forward to what they do next. The players in the band have found their place and their voice, and it's a good sound and a good record, and very, very happy with it. Let's talk about the cover. And if we look through the history of our reaction podcast covers, the Somnia cover is actually one of my favorite album covers of Hawkwind. It's unique. It doesn't look like anything else Hawkwind have ever put out as covers go. And it's a piece of art. It took us a while to figure out what it was, and I can't remember now, but it had something to do with an old painting and something put over the top of it, whatever, and the fonts and everything else. And I really liked it. The Future Never Waits is one of my least favorite Hawkwind covers of all time. And in Stories from Time and Space, we weren't massively keen on the covers. Nothing hugely offensive about it now that I look at it in retrospect. But I remember us looking at this, and I think I ranted about AI and how it was the start of something, but it hadn't been developed. So uneven in terms of covers. But we get to Stories from Time and Space, and it's definitely an improvement on the last two, right, Matt?
Yeah, I think so. There's still something, like you said, slightly CGI-y about it. And I do feel like CGI stuff is starting to get almost its own aesthetic, or certainly can fall into its own aesthetic a little bit. And I feel like it's quite easy to identify that this is that. Because there's a couple of things that I feel like I don't know if it's choiceful or if they're like, that'll do, and that's always difficult when you think about AI stuff, because the fact that there's so many monitors and there's one seat is weird for me. And I don't know if that's supposed to be profound, like there's one person left, or whether or not they just didn't generate enough seats and they thought, well, that's fine. That kind of thing. It's difficult for me to understand if that was in the prompts or whether or not it is just what they've got. We have what looks like an Earth or an Earth-like planet in front of us. So maybe this is someone getting ready to depart because there is no space for this person, even though it says us, which implies more people, although whether or not they're talking about generally, who knows? Clearly, they're doing a lot of scanning of this planet. There's lots of Earths on the monitors and stuff. And then we have the cosmos in front, kind of foreboding and inviting at the same time. Very blue. And again, blue being a cold color, potentially the color of, sort of trepidation, of coldness, of isolation. So there's a lot of blue. Interestingly, we have the contrast of the blue sea, which is the fact that it makes our planet even nourishing, and the fact that we can be here, mixed with the blue of space, which will definitely kill you. So there's quite an interesting idea there between the mix of what blues can mean. Hawkwind and There Is No Space for Us is also blue. So we're following that whole theme. There's a general lack of contrast. In fact, even the ship is very grey, which is closer to blue than any other color. But also There Is No Space for Us is written in a font which doesn't look too paranoid or evil or foreboding. It almost looks kind of like Captain Scarlet or something. It has this kind of there is no space for us kind of feeling, like almost like 70s radio play for me. So I don't know whether or not that font is my favorite, but like I said, I can listen to the music and feel there is a kinship between the art and the music rather than the title and the music. So yeah, definitely compared to giant clock that looks like it belongs in your aunt's bathroom, I'm massively happy with this as an evolution. Even if I can't, again, quite tell the complete intentionality, I feel like I can get some stuff out of it, even if it's just me putting all my own thoughts into it. At least I can, which is something which not every album cover gives you. So I'd take it as a win.
Yeah, and Joe, even if there are elements here individually that are AI generated, there's composition. This whole cover is not just a prompt to an AI image generator. there are pieces here put together for a reason, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I have to say I hadn't had any thoughts on the cover whatsoever because I haven't been able to look at it properly because, as I say, I've only streamed it on Spotify. So I couldn't possibly do such an in-depth analysis as Matt has just done, but I'm sure I agree with everything he says. I do like the return of the logo that was used on Stories. I do like that logo, actually. That's quite nice. It's an overtly science fictional cover of a ship, and as I said, whether it's a ship where the humans have already left that ship or they've died out, and the ship is continuing its voyage, nevertheless, there may be a metaphor there. I think on the whole, I have to say, when you think back to the Barney Bubbles sleeves for the classic Hawkwind albums, and Doug Smith, who was the manager at the time, used to say that Hawkwind's albums wouldn't sound the same without Barney's sleeves.
Agreed.
And I think that's the truth for probably most albums. You know, it does have quite a big impact often in how you listen to an album, what's on the cover. And so I think that they could do better is the only thing I'd say. It's certainly better than the last album cover, which I think is actually pretty awful. I really do. I have to say I much prefer The Future Never Waits even compared to Stories. But again, similar to The Future Never Waits, I think as Matt was saying, the title, it's not so much the font that worries me, but the way it's on that curve again, but it's not a very good curve. Yeah, so I think that they could do better with their album covers these days. So because the music they're producing deserves, I think, kind of probably some better imagery. Oddly enough, I think as we talked about with Stories, there was some other artwork around that was much, much better, much nicer than what they eventually decided on. So who knows? I'm not even going to get into the AI debate because it already feels like you could talk about that forever. I don't know how this stuff is generated. I kind of feel that I would like an artist to have produced something, with the sweat of their brow rather than just give instructions to a computer. But I don't know whether that's actually, now a kind of outmoded way of doing things, to be honest. But yeah, so I don't have actually that great thoughts about it. But I think that Hawkwind could do better with their cover art.
It's an interesting one. I like the logo as well. The logo for The Future Never Waits was just the kind of one they'd used as a back projection for years and years and years, basically, and felt that it didn't have a lot of thought behind it. But this one does. So I like that Hawkwind logo, that font. The imagery and the AI thing is tricky. And I was chatting to Matt about this. The airbrushed science fiction book cover art style. There are so many millions of references for it that it's an art style that AI can reproduce really well and really easily. I know it's because I've done it. I play with all the models. It's part of my job. And because I love science fiction, this is the stuff that I generate because it means that the research is fun while I'm doing it. And it's incredibly easy to generate the stuff. But that said, this is the new way that art is done. It's like people using Photoshop back in the day. People probably early on went, oh, well, that's done with Photoshop. And now you don't think twice about it. This is something that we need to get accustomed to, that you're more of an orchestrator than an artist in that sense, if that's the way it's done. And I feel sorry for anyone who actually does airbrush science fiction artwork because no one will believe them anymore. You've got to put some kind of spin on it that makes it your own. And my point, I think, here would be that that's not what's happened. But I much prefer it to the previous two. I think it's a step forward in as much as there seems to be more thought in there and what to do with the images, which I'm into. And I do like blue, so that works for me, all the different blues. Interestingly, on the back of the vinyl, which I'll just show you guys now, there's kind of a return to that retro future 50s thing that was going on. And I do quite like that. It's very simple, but nicely done. So on the whole, as a package, I think it's the best one since Somnia. And Somnia is a big one for me. I really like Somnia as a package. But yeah, positive, a step forward, I think, as a whole. There Is No Space for Us is a really positive addition to Hawkwind's massive library of music. At least if the art isn't Barney Bubbles, it doesn't detract from the music, which, is decent. So there you go. That is our hot take, our reaction to There Is No Space for Us. I'm sure you'll all let us know what you think. We will come back to this, obviously, and I'm fascinated actually by what happens when we eventually reach these albums and how we reconsider them with proper listens. For Hawkbinge, we'll listen to these things 20, 30, 40 times and take copious notes, and that hasn't happened here. That's not what these are. So, a good one to add. Thanks, Joe, as ever, for coming on. You've been very busy. You had a beautiful cover feature for Prog, right? With the Warrior on the Edge of Time.
Yeah, no, so I got asked to do that. It's Jerry Ewing, the editor of Prog. It's certainly his favorite Hawkwind album, if not his favorite album, full stop. So he's always been a great supporter of that album. And a lot of people still, say, oh, what are Hawkwind doing in prog? They're not progressive rock. But I think the definition of prog is quite flexible these days. And then, of course, Warrior is the album which has lots and lots of mellotron, lots of synth and violin. And as I was saying, it's very much a Simon House album in a way that I would, say that the last three albums, and actually particularly this one, is a Tim Lewis album. He's the guy who I think is making the big difference here, not to take away from the other players and the fact that they're very clearly a very well integrated, cohesive band, but I think he's the guy who makes the difference and is also, I assume, involved in the sound engineering as well. Warrior is notorious for its sound is incredibly muggy and dense sound I was talking about earlier, but it's absolutely perfect. I don't know how they made it sound like that. I know that Stephen Wilson did his remix. It's like dismantling the engine of the car and cleaning all of the parts and putting it back together again. But it's not the same car anymore. And anyway, so yes, to answer your question, there wasn't actually a question, was there? No.
No, but I'll ask you one now. In the lead up to writing your feature for Prog, do you just know the album so well that you just did it? Or did you re-listen to it a couple of times?
Oh, I did re-listen to it a couple of times. I mean, the real challenge of doing these pieces, to be honest, is actually getting the quotes for it, because Dave and Alan Powell are literally the only people who are available to talk from the band. Mm-hmm. I'd already spoken to Alan Powell for Days of the Underground, so I was able to reuse some of his quotes. And we did actually get a little bit of new input from Dave, Julian Marsalek, who did the interview in Prog that follows on from my Warrior piece about the new album. He spoke to Dave for that, and he asked him a few questions about Warrior, which I reused some of the quotes from that. But I was very lucky to discover, and I'd forgotten about this, that the 2013 Atom Henge reissue of Warrior, which of course was the first reissue since like the 1990s, because there'd been all of these licensing issues around it. But anyway, there was a very good booklet in that where Malcolm Dome interviewed Dave. So a lot of the quotes are actually from that. But that's the biggest challenge of doing those pieces is, you're telling a story, and as you know, I like to talk about the music, but people expect to hear from the players themselves. But I think it flows quite nicely. And again, the feedback has been quite good. And it's an incredible privilege to be able to write pieces like that and to have somebody ask me to do them. So yeah, very happy about that.
That's great. It's always great to have you writing about Hawkwind. How's your Peter Hamill?
So the Peter Hamill book is effectively finished. It's 195,000 words long, which is about 600 pages. So it's longer than Days of the Underground. I am at the moment just gathering the final visual material for it, and the layout and design is going to start in a couple of weeks' time. So I had hoped that it was going to be out for summer, but it looks like it's now going to be more towards the end of the year, but that is definitely coming.
So Joe has written 2 books in the time it's taken us to not quite do the 90s.
That is actually factually correct. Yes. That's interesting, actually, because, Joe, of course, that means that your recent Hawkwind listening has gone from Warrior on the Edge of Time to There Is No Space for Us. Ours has gone from Distant Horizons to There Is No Space for Us. It's kind of interesting how those juxtapositions work in terms of your appreciation for what you're hearing. We'll look out for the Peter Hamill and definitely get your edition of Prog magazine while you can. That book, Malcolm Dome's, it's in the box set that was released in 2013, and we covered that a little bit on the episode because it's beautifully done. And Malcolm passed away not long after, is that right? Or have I completely made that up?
He died a couple of years ago.
Yeah, very sad. Great loss, but wonderful writing. Matt, thanks as ever. And Pod Reaction crew, I'm pretty sure this won't be the last time that this crew assembles for a reaction. Hopefully there will be many more of these. We will jump back in the DeLorean and go back to the end of the millennium, and we will see you then. Technicians of Spaceship Earth, you have been listening to Hawkbinge, the Hawkwind podcast. It was devised and presented by Andy Hood and Matt Longstaff. The soundtrack was produced by Dissonant.
To contact the show, drop us a message on Facebook, Instagram, or X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, by searching @Hawkbinge, or send an email to podcast@hawkbinge.space. Hawkbinge is a proud member of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. To find more great band and music-focused podcasts like this one, head to @DeepDivePodNet on Twitter and dive in. Thank you as always for listening. We'll see you next time.